Let me briefly introduce, we're here for the panel session. I'm Michael Mitzenmacher, a former student, TA, and mentee of Harry Lewis. He's served me in all of these roles, and I'll be leading the panel where we'll be talking about various aspects of education. We've brought together a collection of both professors and P and not professors, the NP, for this panel. This is a P versus NP panel that we're having to discuss these matters of education. Their bios are all in the handouts you have, so I'm just going to briefly introduce them by name and get to questions. My plan for the panel, for which we have about an hour and 10, hour 15 minutes, is that for about the first half, I have some guiding questions to try and juice the discussion that I'll ask the panel, and the panel will comment on. You don't all have to comment on each question. You can just comment on the ones you want to, and I'll try and keep you to like a minute on these initial questions. But then what we'd like to do, all of us would like to do, is open up, once we have some of these questions or ideas out there, to open it up more to all of you to ask questions about education that you find interesting or concerning, and hopefully what I provide will be a short springboard to that. Let me start by introducing our panel. Over at the far end at the professor side, we have Lynn Stein from Olin. We have David Malin here from Harvard, and we have Eric Roberts from Stanford. On the not professor side, we have Jonathan Katzman from Minerva. We have Hannah Bloomberg from the Khan Academy. And we have Ali Partovi from Code.org, as well as several other things. All right, so let me start by yeah, let's cheer the panel. Thank you. All right, so let me start with a question for the panel that, I, of course, sat in on many of Harry's lectures. And I had noticed that recently Harry had changed some of his teaching for one of his courses. For CS20, he's adopted what's called the flipped classroom style, where students actually prepare ahead of time by watching a lecture or otherwise preparing material, and then they come in and actually work out problems in the classroom time as opposed to the standard lecture format. I admit I am teaching this semester. I have a large class, and I still use the standard lectured format where I stand up there and present the material to the students. And so I'm hoping that all of you will explain to me, what am I doing wrong? What should I be doing? Like, clearly, I guess this is no longer the way. And how should we think of lectures versus non-lectures in the university environment? What should I really be doing?
I note that you're looking straight at me.
I'll start with you, Lynn.
I think the question of whether you're doing something wrong really depends on what you think it is you're doing. What is education for? What is CS 121, if that's the class you're talking about? What is it? What is its purpose, and what are your goals? The lecture comes out of the idea that the goal of the university is preservation of knowledge. Eric Mazur likes to say that it's a really nice way to transfer the contents of the professor's notebook to the contents of the student's notebook, possibly without touching any of the systems in between. I actually think there are lectures that are considerably more than that, and as a student who benefited from many, many lecture classes, I think there's a lot that can happen in a lecture other than copying the notebooks. At the same time, lecture takes everybody in the room and say an hour of 150 people's time. And in 150 person hours, one person is broadcasting. And it's 150 synchronous person hours. We've gotten you all into the same space. We've taken the same time. Is that the best possible way we can use that time? And the answer to that question depends, again, on what you're trying to accomplish. So a flipped classroom takes the premise that what I'm trying to accomplish as an instructor is to give the students an opportunity to form their own knowledge, and I'm setting up that time when we're co-present to make the best use of what we each bring into that room. There are a lot of other models as well, and many of my colleagues on this panel and many of you have tried a whole lot of different ways, but before you can answer the question, is that the right way or the wrong way, I think you have to ask the question, what are you trying to accomplish, and how can you best use the different kinds of resources you have?
So first, I would just like to pose to do active learning here. Who's fallen asleep in a lecture? Let's be honest. All right, so this was a quotidian experience for me, I think, at Harvard. Sorry, Margot. Sorry, Harry. Sorry, Roger Cheever. One of the things, so at Minerva, and I could tell anyone who's interested in Minerva about it later, we teach all in small seminar, also fully flipped classroom. And based on the science of learning, and this is the thing that is really amazing and answer this question, is there's like effectively scientific proof that lecturing is by far not the best way to learn. It's an amazing way to teach. As a teacher, you could teach to 10 people or 1,000 people. You actually only still need one teacher. It's fantastic for the university. But as a learner, it's really not good. And there's two basic principles that we always rest on. So one is, if you are actually going to learn, you need to do depth of processing. So yes, writing notes is one form of processing, but you need to be actively engaging with the material. And as Lynn just said, if you're actually doing a project or working on problems together, it's a much deeper way. Secondly, you need to build on systems you already know about. You need to attach that learning to something where you have a small toehold already. And that could happen in a lecture or could not. It's sort of a separate, that's more around the curriculum design. So we at Minerva have taken that to be like everything is small seminar, everything has to be active student engagement, fully flipped classroom. In the last story I'll just quickly tell on this, when I was talking to Harry about Minerva and he gave me the wise advice to go there, he told me the story of changing the classroom. I think it was in Pierce, the library, where he said, I think it was roughly $20 million that it cost to rip out the library. I don't know, some huge number, to basically put in these like very advanced technology, which is tables and chairs with wheels. And so I love that picture of, at Harvard, in order to try this new technology in classrooms, you needed to spend a bunch of money to rip out the library and put in tables and chairs with wheels.
If I could just jump in with very quickly, I think there are some issues with the lecture format, as you mentioned. I mean, I'm fairly comfortable now speaking in public, but I would say if you had asked me to do it, a certain time earlier in my career, it would, give me butterflies in my stomach. And so there's that, and the whole kids falling asleep, it kind of puts a lot of pressure on the lecturer to do things that are separate from learning just to kind of stay exciting, like come out in a bunny suit or something to like prevent people from falling asleep. But what I would say, I really liked what Lynn said. I would actually rephrase it slightly stronger, I guess, which is I would say that prior to certain technology, the lecture was the best way to, to impart a lecture. Now you have the option of just watching it on video, and then that begs the question of, is there no better use of that time? And if there is any better use of that time, of everyone here being together, then you are probably better off having the lecture be watch a video at home and then use that time for something that is a better use. So if you're unable to think of any better use for the synchronous time of all those people, then I guess the lecture then you're not doing anything wrong. You have found the best use of that time. But if there's any better way to engage the audience, the lecture is not the best. So.
Oh, no. David, go ahead.
Well, and I think to ascertain whether you're doing something wrong would be to ask not just if students are coming, for instance, to lectures, especially if it's filmed, but are they not coming and are they not watching? Because in our intro class, CS50, which I now teach, was a descendant of NatSci 110 and AS11, students have been decreasingly coming, and we as a class have been increasingly embracing this. And indeed, this past year, for the first time, did we very explicitly ask students, come for the first lecture, come for the last lecture, but we don't expect you to come for any of the ones in the middle. And this is in part driven by my realization over time that as much as I enjoy lecturing in the class experience, and while as much as I think we can inspire, hopefully, some of those times, that first time, that last time, I'm not convinced we can do it 26 times, 2 times a week, for some 13 weeks. And an interesting data point for us was 2 years ago, we rolled out this experiment with Yale University where we have a sort of equivalent student body in New Haven experiencing the course largely from afar. We film the lectures, they watch online, but we have local sections and office hours and more in both of these cities. And as a side effect of this experiment, we realized in fall 2015, when We held our first lecture at Harvard as usual, but we held our second lecture at Yale and streamed it in the reverse direction back to Harvard students. We sort of accidentally conditioned 100% of Harvard students in CS50 to experience the class online. And that semester, we saw a marked downtick in physical attendance at lectures thereafter, even though the lectures thereafter were at Harvard. And we went from an equilibrium of maybe 30, 40% attendance to 15% as early as the second or third week. But when you look at the data, upwards of 70% plus of students were nonetheless watching online, which I dare say is a better experience in many cases for the simple reasons that you can pause and fast forward and rewind and review transcripts and all of these digital enhancements. And so to the question of whether you're doing something wrong, I think it really is not necessarily a bad thing to be lecturing and engaging students in that way, but the venue via which they engage with it, I think they have multiple options now.
I'm, I think, the oldest of the college alumni here, and so therefore I have to take the older, more conservative position. I don't think you're doing anything wrong. I've heard President John Hennessy, a computer scientist, just left the presidency, say in public on several occasions that the lecture is dead, even though in his department, lecturers don't lose those people. I mean, yes, we're on quarters, so it's a little shorter, so we don't have to quite sustain the full semester. But people come and they are convinced to go into computer science because of what they see modeled in the front of that lecture room. We put the best teachers we have ever seen in front of that lecture, not because that's the right way to engage students and convey material, but because that's the way to model an excitement about the material and get it shared, to model that education with a soul, because it's a person up there. Just for all of the people who are very concerned about it, no one is going to give lots of money 30 years down the line for their online class. You know, it's just not going to happen. When we ask students why they major in computer science, and 20% of Stanford students are now majoring in computer science, the universal answer, I can't stress this enough, is that they came in thinking they were going to do something else. They took those introductory classes, they took our introductory classes, and they decided to major in computer science. Marissa Mayer, who spoke at my graduation party earlier this year, she took the course for non-majors, got excited by that, and then took the course for majors. We are in the business of being evangelical about what we love. And I don't think that that comes across as well. I mean, of course there are reasons to use all these other technologies, and we use those too. I mean, the point is that it's wrong to think that the lecture is where people learn the material. They learn it when they're actually doing it on the assignments. And so we staff the cluster where students are working 70 hours a week so they can always get that help. That's, the lecture is for something different. If you want to convey material, at least ever since Gutenberg, we've had a model for doing that. But that's not what the lecture has ever been for, and it's not what I think you can do with it. And you know, I think that there's room for all these experimentations, but don't throw the lecture out. It's way premature.
I guess speaking directly to CS20, since I was a student in TF for the class twice, I do think you can capture a lot of the excitement in a flipped classroom, even without the lecture. Since you're working in these small groups, we pair one TF with about 4 to 8 students. I felt like I got to interact with those students even more than I would have if I were standing at the front of a section. And to try to convey my excitement for not only the material, but also the process of working from problem to solution.
All right, let me go.
Question about, can you guys address how distractible devices affect the way?
Does anyone want to take that? Have distractible devices?
Can they pay attention long enough to really do it?
So,
I'm sorry, I wasn't looking.
Lecture when it's at its best, I think, is very much what you were talking about, Eric. Lecture is good theater at its best, and it does the things that theater does for you. And when I go to the theater, I don't get distracted by my cell phone, partly because they've made me turn it off, but partly because when I go to the theater, it's usually really compelling, and I'm not drawn to the devices.
But you're not a student.
I'm not a student, it's true. I think if your purpose is to have a broadcast experience that's genuinely compelling, I think it's possible to get around the distraction. I think the problem is that often lecture isn't understood to be a broadcast experience which has to be compelling in all the ways that Eric, even hearing you answer that question, I know why your students feel the way they do. Unfortunately, not all of us have those gifts, and I can tell you that for me, what I mostly want to accomplish in my classroom is not something that I think is best accomplished by my standing in front of a large group of people and broadcasting, because I don't have Eric's gifts. So in that case, I have to deal with the what am I trying to accomplish, how am I using it, and then how do I avoid distractibility. Actually, for me, the devices are often an asset because what my students are doing is individualized, customized, small group work so much of the time that they're actually using the connectivity as an asset in their face-to-face work. But that's very different from a lecture experience.
Again, I'm willing certainly to have more questions. Yeah, we'll get through some questions first, but if anyone has an immediate question they want to ask related to that, we could probably take one or two more and then move on. And yeah. Al.
Isn't there something more, though, that we can do with technology beyond video and beyond, Eric and his most wonderful projection? Isn't there something we can do that would make essentially this less?
We're doing lots of things with technology. I mean, I think some of the most exciting projects that I've seen in recent years, Chris Peach is one of our faculty, and his doctoral dissertation was on using traces from all the different versions of code that people produced in the introductory class, do machine learning on that, understand where the clusters are that represent areas where people are confused, and then use that to figure out how to move people and do those things online at the same time. As we've built our own tools, collect those data, and be able to apply them. I mean, the technology gives us tremendous opportunities. Technology has improved the lecture since I was lecturing in that Sci 110. But it's all, I think, really about caring about those students in some ways and making that demonstrable in everything you do. So I'm not in this instance a Luddite, I am in some others, but I think you can use it very well.
Yeah, and I think to follow up on that, there's also this tension between online versus offline, lecture versus not lecture, and I think you have to look at more, what is the mode in which you're teaching? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to do project-based learning? Are you trying to do seminar? Are you trying to do flipped classroom? Technology be brought to bear in many different ways across all of those, similarly with what they're doing just in students' homework offline. So you really need to think less about, am I lecturing or not lecturing, and what is the purpose of that, and more about, again, what is the learning outcome for the student, and what's the best way to achieve it?
So, Harry.
I just want to throw in a comment. It depends a lot on the course material. I mean, Lynn asked the right question.
Right.
And the answer to Lynn's question is not the same for every, for every course. So the flipping works very well in CS20 because the course material is so modular. And in other material, the lecture format with the right lecturer is going to still, I think, be superior. But I just want to add that one of the great advantages of the flipping is that the professor may not even need to be in the classroom. So, for example, I was able to teach CS20 quite successfully from 10 to 11 this morning. Michelle Danoff over there in the corner, who was one of my undergraduate teaching assistants, ran the class just fine without me. So, thank you, Michelle.
Right. Well, let me ask one or two other questions that cover other things, and I'll allow people, will certainly come back to these things after we first. I also like the idea that maybe we'll just have Harry answer every question after the panel as we go through the. Okay, Margot. She's my boss.
Because I so rarely disagree with Harry, I'm gonna disagree a little bit, which is that even things that are not modular can be flipped very effectively. So what Jonathan and Ollie didn't tell you is that one of the courses where they regularly fell asleep was in fact my operating systems course, because they had been working all night, as Hadi explained to me.
Yes.
And I have vivid recollections of one class where they were like totally sacked out in the middle of Years 208. And I was going around the room like asking people to contribute parts of questions, and they were like out. Anyway. But that is a course that is incredibly not modular in terms of concepts, and yet it turned out to be a very effective course to flip, because the challenge in that course is really translating the concepts into code. And where most students spend those all-night hours is in that process. And if you can jumpstart them in the classroom doing that, believe it or not, it actually does save them some time in the long run. So I think modularity may not be the only thing that makes flipping practical.
Let me take a different question, because I'm going to try and hit a couple different levels of scale or scope in the course of this. And so this is maybe a similar related question, but at a different level. So Harry's career, of course, has been deeply tied to Harvard University. He's not only led the computer science department and temporarily C's at various points in times, but was the undergraduate dean for Harvard University for many years. And as we've seen in the last question, we're increasingly seeing more and more technology, online courses, tools, offerings, and so on, that many people argue reduce the need of the traditional university to be what we think of as the home of learning. And so we've seen technology wreak havoc across many other fields, many other institutions, the press being one of the most notable ones. So as technology continues to work its way here, what should we think of the role of the university being in the future? And how can institutions such as Harvard adapt to these changing means and methods of education so that we can continue to survive and hopefully thrive? Anyone?
I get asked this question all the time. Sorry, adjusting the mic here. I get asked this question all the time. People are like, aren't you disrupting universities? Do you want to see all universities destroyed? And it's just like unequivocally wrong and not our view at all. And especially the top universities, we expect them to remain the top universities, and we happily will hire all of the PhDs you produce to teach our undergraduates. So we appreciate that. And so I think, again, there's a question here less of what is the purpose of the university, and more if you're going to spend $60,000, $70,000, and especially I think this is, again, not going to be an issue for the top 10, 20, 30, I don't know, universities, but for, say, number 50 through 100, I think a lot, and I hear this from parents now, people are really starting to question that value. And so that's where I think you're just going to see a lot of other tracks for certain jobs go other ways, software engineering probably being one of them. And it could also be nurses, paralegals. There's lots of jobs that could take the boot camp model and do very well with just a year or two of post-secondary education. So I think that'll be very interesting. And I think the biggest issue with universities that we see is, like this university, there's a lot of focus on research and really understanding the balance of research versus undergraduate teaching. I think I would love to hear some of the professors' view of that. That to me is like the biggest split of really where university can be focused.
One of the professors want to respond?
We saw in Guy Steele's notebook this notion that, in fact, the things that you learn at a university are mostly the things that you learn outside of the classroom. We come together in these academic communities to experience each other, to learn from one another, to have this experience, which is almost impossible to have in other places, to get out of that insularity, to try new things. I've been extremely fortunate at Stanford. I've had the chance to teach courses listed in 17 different departments and programs, from English to history to computer science to science, technology, and society. You just name it, you know. It's just, I found a place where somebody wanted to teach a course with me, and we did it. And it's been amazing to have that old style. You know, I was telling Harry the other day, I've been living in Oxford, England for the last 15 years. It's the first place I've ever felt like I was at home, you know. It's been there for almost 1,000 years. It's, you know, people have been doing this kind of thing and making tremendous progress for society because of what we as academicians and as communities of students and professors and everyone else who's around the university does. I believe that that's the future of universities, and I worry mostly about sort of the faddishness that comes along with each new technological marvel. In the Senate, faculty senate at Stanford some years ago, maybe 6 years ago, there was a panel on MOOCs right after, you know, MOOCs became popular, and every single panelist, you know, was in favor of MOOCs. You know, ran the gamut from A to B. You know, it was not exactly a balanced panel. And then 3 years later, if they didn't have another one on flipped classrooms, where they began by saying, well, you know, MOOCs didn't work out, but here's a panel on flipped classrooms, which had exactly the same range. And no one saw the irony. You know, it just was, you know, we have to understand that universities have contributed something, and I think a lot of people in universities understand that. But there is this call, and there's this pressure from industry, from parents who don't understand that, you know, places like Harvard and Stanford are going to fund their children's education if they can't afford it. I mean, you know, we got to get that out, because it's so transformative to be able to go into, you know, I'm a hereditary academic, so I got this from, you know, from day one, but a lot of people don't have the advantage of growing up in a family where books and ideas matter, and at least for 4 years we can give them that.
Does anyone else want to comment on this? Or questions out from the audience? Yeah.
We've seen lots of examples of technology disrupting industries. So if you ask that question with respect to universities, you have places like Harvard and Stanford that have enormous financial resources. My question is whether the resources of places like Harvard and Stanford are an asset to be used to reconfigure things along the lines that you've described, or perhaps in other ways. But one could also imagine them being a liability that create enormous vested interests and bureaucracies that prevent those changes from occurring and allow the Olins of the world to make the kinds of changes that need to occur. Which is true?
Is that an either or? Because I think it really is both. So I feel like I have only one question, and it's, what is the purpose? So what is the purpose of a university? And I actually think historically universities have had a lot of different purposes, and we're seeing some of those purposes come into tension in new ways recently. And I think that's part of why, you know, as long as I can remember, there's been the crisis of university education, but I do think it's gotten more acute in some ways, and I think in the next 30 to 50 years, this landscape will have changed. I don't think in the next 5 years this landscape will have changed, in spite of Minerva's best efforts, or Olin's. So the university, you know, from the perspective of a student, is it education? Is it training? And I say that not in a pejorative way, but in a empowering me to go on and do the next thing, empowering me to the next stage. Is it finishing school? Is it a community, a respite, a place to grow and mature, that's where it's a liminal space that's not your parents' home or your childhood, and it's not your fully independent adulthood either? And then, of course, that's only with respect to students, but there are also questions about, is the university about preservation of knowledge, which historically, I mean, that's where Bologna came from. That's where Oxford came from. Preserving knowledge in a time of uncertainty. now I'm pretty sure that everything that exists now is going to continue to exist in some way, shape, or form electronically forever. The question is finding it. I'm not worried about preservation. I'm worried about understanding and use, but preservation actually feels pretty good. But maybe the university is about creation of knowledge. That's a different thing. And that used to be really tied to that educational piece, and now it's not clear whether that mooring is coming uncoupled. Or there's the sanctuary space, the place where people can think about things that are very far in the future and not just what's going to happen tomorrow. And all of those are jobs the university could do. I don't know that all universities can do all of them, or even that any universities can do all of them. I think we're at a moment where we're starting to disaggregate some of those questions. And unfortunately, we're not able to design clean slate mostly. It was lovely to have that opportunity. Though even in Olin 17 years ago, when we were literally a hole in the ground, it turned out it wasn't really a clean slate. There were really a lot of structures and constraints in the world. But the finances of how universities currently run, which is different from how they ran 100 years ago, and which is different from how they ran 300 years ago, and will be different in 20 years or possibly sooner, depending on politics. How do we explore what it is we want to be about, and then find models? And the people on this panel are all in different ways exploring alternate models of how we can accomplish some of those jobs. And I do think, because the university, Harvard was created about preservation, it is harder to change things at Harvard. And yet, those of you who read my bio may know that I taught. Literally, Harvard could not find a space, physical space, for the class that I brought to Harvard the semester I was here on sabbatical. I was teaching in an atrium. The Pierce renovation happened within a couple of years and is a space that would have been a lovely one to have. This building contains spaces that changed as a result of conversations that happened that year. And I've seen plans for what might be built in Alston, which is already beginning to change. So even Harvard is capable of change, which gives me enormous hope for what's possible in the future.
Thank you. Let me go on to another question. Take a slightly different area. So Harry's grandchildren are arguably just a bit too young to be starting to teach them computing. You know, arguably, maybe they're ready now. And I would say, I think historically, teaching of computing, not just coding, but all of computing, at the K through 12 levels, in the United States in particular, but also around the world, has been sort of at best minimal and haphazard. And yet, somehow, out of that, I work on admissions with Marlon and Harry. I see Harvard applications now with students doing things ranging from building simple apps that are being used at their schools, to building websites, to doing research using AI to find better ways to diagnose cancer, even without some sort of formal training. One thought or one feeling is that seeing that makes me feel we could be doing so much better if we actually had a better developed, more standardized formal system. So for the panel, how should we be thinking about teaching computing at these K through 12 levels? Should computing, like math, become part of the standard curriculum? How could we make that happen, and what would that look like? Do we actually think that some type of standard program would be a help, or is the diversity and fast pace of the computer field make it so that standardization of a program would actually be a bug rather than a feature in terms of teaching at these levels?
So I'm gonna take this one because code.org is essentially, actually I'd love to ask how many people here have heard of code.org or the Hour of Code? Okay, so I actually take issue with the suggestion that computer science is haphazardly taught. I think that would have been very accurate if you had said that 4 years ago when Code.org was founded. 4 years ago, only about less than 10% of schools in the United States offered any form of computer science at any, one AP class or so on. And only 9 states in the country accepted it as satisfying graduation requirements. Something like 2% of students took it. And the vast, 90% of students didn't even have the option to take it. Today, and largely due to the work of Code.org, but also partners that we work with, 10% of K through 12 students on the planet have done coding. 20% of kids in the United States are learning it, which is significantly up. 20% of teachers in the United States, 20% of students in the US have an account on Code.org to learn computer science curriculum. This is mostly K-5 actually, and 20% of students in the United States. Hundreds of school districts have made commitments to embrace it, and some of the largest ones have already rolled out CS to every school in their district. Code.org alone is training about 25,000 teachers per year to teach computer science. So in contrast, there were only about 18,000 teachers in the entire country that taught it 4 years ago. There are now about 50,000 newly trained ones in the last 2 years. So there's a sea change that has occurred already, and about 30 states now and 11 countries outside of the U.S. have officially embraced it in their in the educational policy. What I would say, though, that the key to all this having happened in the last 5 years has been the ability for the curriculum to be fluid. So if it had been via textbooks, it would have been a lot harder to, first of all, it would be more expensive to disseminate it, but also harder to stay abreast with what you pointed out. It's a fast-moving field. So I think a key part of it is that teaching computer science to kids can be done via the web and via interactive, step-by-step tutorials, and then you can see, oh, everyone's getting stuck on screen number 5. There must be an issue that is challenging for young kids. Let's go look at it and see what the challenge is and fix it. And you can essentially tweak the curriculum literally daily to make it more effective. And that's a huge part. I will also say for the youngest kids, perhaps even Harry's grandchildren, I certainly would say that learning how to spell and write English and all the grammatical weirdnesses of exceptions to every rule, that is far more challenging than learning the highly logical and predictable rules of computer science. And as a child, one of the most comforting things is to have rules that don't have exceptions. Here's the rule, and once you learn the rule, you learned it. In English, every rule has exceptions. There are no, it's extremely confusing and frankly discomforting to kids. In a language like a computer language, or here is the rule, there are no exceptions. Once you learn the rule, you learned it. That provides enormous comfort to kids. I, as a kid growing up in Iran, in Persia, I grew up during the Iranian Revolution, and my entire life was filled with chaos and fear. For me, learning to code was actually a form of comfort, because here was the only part of my world where laws and rules were consistent and were not haphazard, and where I could have something of consistency to comfort me. But I would say that's true for all kids. It's easier to learn an if-then statement than to learn how to form English grammar is actually more confusing. And I would say it makes sense to teach computer science principles before teaching writing and reading. Speaking, obviously, speaking is, our brains are evolved for speaking. But reading and writing using the English language is extremely challenging for kids to learn. And I would say it's, you may not be able to teach them how to type Python code, but the type of code where they drag and drop, icons that say, follow the up arrow or left arrow, or move the bunny this way or that way, that stuff is actually, I think, easier to teach than basic English.
I actually think this is one of the most potentially impactful opportunities for higher ed, especially as this MOOC craze is sort of entering equilibrium, is to focus not so much on trying to teach masses of hundreds of thousands of people, the sort of end nodes of the graph, but to actually start focusing more on uplifting K-12 and some of the inner nodes. Indeed, as we and our team here at Harvard has focused a lot more on grades 7 through 12 and essentially porting our own college curriculum in CS50 to a high school audience, focusing not just on the students, but on putting together more supportive lesson plans and professional development and training programs for teachers. I mean, hands down, that has been what we've experienced to be one of the most limiting factors. It's the math teachers who are the closest thing that the principal can identify to a computer science teacher, and so he or she is being asked to teach Introduction to Computer Science, or the phys ed teacher in some cases. And so the fact that we increasingly have these hopefully high quality educational resources that are full form courses themselves, so that a teacher on his or her own can tune in to a Stanford or Harvard or MIT or Berkeley class and has access to not only the experience of being a student, but on the tail end of now, much like our own Harvard tradition of bootstrapping our own courses by teaching students who then become our own TFs. I think we're increasingly seeing that a potentially impactful model where we have our high school teachers taking some form of CS50 or a Berkeley course or the like, and then one semester, 1 year after, are they themselves better equipped, not necessarily fully confident, but can now take on more of a TA-like role in their own high school or middle school classroom, leaning on the resources of a place like this, which to the question earlier about resources, I think is hands down one of the things these institutions in higher ed should be doing as a social good. And then a year later, 2 years later, as they get more comfortable, much like our own graduating seniors, can leaning on us become less of a thing? They can stand up full-fledged, and now we have a full-fledged computer science teacher teaching some program. And so that's what's gotten us, I think, the most excited about MOOCs and online education, is how we can reach the inner nodes of this graph and achieve some kind of exponentiation by teaching the teachers.
Going back to the question of standardization, I think one thing that's particularly exciting about AP 50 and similar curricula is the move from AP Computer Science A, which said, oh, you have to learn Java and you have to learn it in this way and you have to, do this grid world project in order to do well on the exam, and then moving towards this AP Computer Science Principles, which is based on things like, understanding critical thinking and problem solving skills and creativity, and it's completely language agnostic. I think that's like a really awesome thing to be able to move away from, it's important that you learn Java, to it's important that you learn these computer science principles, and then later you can plug in any particular syntax in order to achieve those goals.
If I can actually just riff off of that, I think one of the most important factors in kind of thinking about this is to extract the word code or coding from computer science, and actually, because my organization's name is code.org, it's a blessing and a curse, because there's this whole learn to code movement in schools, and the reality is, it is not about learning to code. In fact, the least valuable part of it is the coding part, and also the most likely to be irrelevant. If you learned Python, like 8 years later, it'll be kind of no longer useful to you. The two things you really are learning, and they're different. One is computational thinking, and logical thinking, the ability to, understand a repeat loop, whether it's called repeat or for or while, or that doesn't matter what the code is or the language is, but the idea that I can instruct this device to do this repeated thing, understanding abstraction, understanding functions, that is extremely useful not only to a career as a coder. That's useful if you want to become a lawyer, for example. It's useful for so many different careers, and it's useful for kids, in 3rd, 4th grade to learn those principles, not just, not the ones who are thinking necessarily vocationally. The other part is what I would call digital literacy. And I would say it's critical to just understanding how the world around you works. There's a reason why every school in America teaches biology. You wouldn't send your kids to a school. Imagine if I told you that if you have a kid in high school, they're going to graduate without knowing what photosynthesis is, or without knowing what their own esophagus is, because we didn't. you would not consider that an education. You would not consider a person to be educated if they came out of high school not learning the basics of the natural world around them. Well, kids these days all have one of these things, and they use it much more frequently than their own esophagus. No, it's true. And I would say they deserve a chance to learn how both work, and they deserve to leave them in the dark about how this huge part of their world works. I'd say it's really kind of, it's frankly, we've failed an entire past generation of, high school kids who have graduated oblivious to computing, and the current generation of kids, we really owe it to them to have them understand it. It's as if we literally, we have entire generations of kids. It's equivalent to having generations who are oblivious to how photosynthesis works or their own esophagus or so on. And it's something I think that's almost an emergency to bring up the digital literacy of the population.
I have a couple of cautionary notes. I mean, the work that Code.org and Khan Academy have done has been fantastic. I mean, and I've been a part of the CS Principles project since it started, and I think that that's moving in the right direction. But there are unintended consequences along these lines that I'm not sure that everyone thinks about. And one of those, you've alluded to, I mean, absolutely professional development is the key part of anything that's going to bring it into the schools, because the teachers don't know it.
Agreed, totally agreed.
And I used to ask my class, how many of you took CS in high school? And lots of hands went up. How many of you knew more than your teachers? And most of the hands stayed up. I remember, I don't know whether Harry remembers this, when I came back to Harvard after starting the department at Wellesley, we talked about there seemed to be a little bit of a decline after this giant bulge at the beginning of the 80s. Why is that happening? And Harry's answer was, it's because they started teaching computer science in high school. Not because they learned it there, but what they learned was that they didn't like it because of what it was, and that's, we've seen it replicated all over the world. So it's not enough to teach it in these schools, you have to teach it well. And so that's professional development. I led a project to build a high school computing curriculum for the island of Bermuda with its 2 high schools and 60,000 people about 15 years ago, and its enormous wealth from offshore tax haven status, so that they could pay $1 million for this project. And so we were teaching all the students, and we knew that professional development was going to be the right thing, and we also anticipated that what we needed to do was train twice as many teachers as we needed, because half of them would leave. As soon as you teach a high school or an elementary school teacher to code, they have opportunities that pay 5 times as much that don't involve discipline. Well, I suppose those of you who've worked in companies can talk about the discipline problem. But anyway, that's, we can't hire at most universities and colleges in this country people who teach computer science and are qualified to teach it. How can poor school districts get the right people? We have to create them, as is being done. But the other, and I think more serious problem, I've distilled this into a soundbite at various conferences of late, is all of these things are working on the demand side of the equation, because in the mid-aughts, we had this decline, mostly I think generated by this perception that all computing jobs were going to be offshored. Right. Complete lunacy. Oops. but people believed it, and it was the world is flat and things like that. And so even after the industry recovered from the dot-com collapse in 1 year, we kept seeing this declining numbers for what was arguably the best job on the planet. And so how is that happening? So there's been a lot of work to increase demand, and my soundbite is actions that increase demand without increasing capacity are suicide. Schools are seeing more and more people coming in that they can't teach. I don't like being 20% of the majors at Stanford because we're only 2% of the faculty, and only one of those numbers is going up. You can guess. And if that's happening at the Stanfords of the world, what's happening at the state schools? And I'll tell you what's happening at the state schools. I'm on the National Academies Committee to look at this problem. Every one of them is imposing strict limits on who can major and who can take courses. So what we're doing is we're generating lots of students who get really excited by this. And the first thing that happens when they get to college is they're told, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We have to work on those two problems together. We have to, there needs to be a change. Absolutely. We need to have a new vision of what computer science can be in the 21st century in universities, because it's part of everything. But the model we have for teaching it now is not sufficient to scale to that level.
So I agree and disagree with some of the things you said. I strongly agree that professional development is critical. And Code.org is actually something like 80% of our time and money is focused on that, on training teachers. It is some of the hardest work to do. I also very strongly agree with your presenting it as a supply and demand, and we see it exactly the same way. Code.org's Hour of Code is basically a marketing stunt to generate demand, and everything else we do is to generate supply, essentially. And we create curriculum, we do professional development, et cetera. I think I would say somewhat disagree with, I think that what you talked about, it's not being taught well, I think that is changing. I'd say that, again, I'd say it's more like 4 or 5 years ago you had this issue where there weren't enough teachers or they weren't capable of teaching it well. And I think that that is improving. And I also think because of, in fact, large extent because of Khan Academy and our work, because kids are now learning it in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, it's a completely different dynamic of, how much they know and how well prepared they are by the time they get to 9th grade, let alone to university. Where I do think a part of the solution is with the kind of universities' challenges is that computer science, I think, really over time needs to be integrated into all subjects. Certainly in the professional world, there's not a single industry that has not been in some way impacted by computers. In academia, I'd say, not just in the university level, but also the high school level and below, perhaps computer science needs to be integrated into lots of other subjects. And then it won't be, oh, we don't have enough CS faculty. It'll be all the other faculty need to learn some CS as part of their existing.
We have about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to open it back up to the audience. I think there are several things to think about. I'll try to sort of do passes around the room. Yeah.
To help with rampant misogyny? Yeah, so this is very near and dear to my heart. And in fact, when we were starting Code.org, we were very seriously considering before choosing what name, we were considering, should we name it something that's focused on women? Should we entirely make the organization be about getting more women to learn computer science? We chose to ultimately have it be kind of universal, but it remains one of our most important metrics that we measure how many girls are doing the Hour of Code. It's 48%. How many girls are enrolled in our classrooms? It's also steadily at around 47, 48%. And so I think the misogyny has been perpetuated because of the fact that prior to Code.org, it was only taught in high school, which means it was an elective, and it wasn't a graduation requirement. So it was only really taken by kids who had already kind of fallen in love with it at home as from their parents or a camp or something, and those tended to be the white or Asian males. Once it's introduced in, say, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, in elementary school, and all the kids are taking it, then it's no longer perceived as a male or female thing. Like if all the other kids in your 3rd grade class do something, you think of it as just something we all do. And the Hour of Code also, as a concept, was very consciously designed for this. Our Code.org actually sort of, our founding idea was there are 3 things we wanted to accomplish. We wanted to help the schools in terms of curriculum, professional development. We wanted to change the rules in terms of education graduation policy, and we wanted to make computer science cool. The hardest part of all three of those was the last. How do you make computer science cool? And especially when the people trying to do so are me and my brother Hadi, who are the nerdiest kids, from our own high school. And then we realized the key to making anything cool is to involve girls in it. It's true. And so the Hour of Code, the idea for the Hour of Code was to get entire classrooms or entire schools to say, we are doing the Hour of Code. That means every student in the entire student body will do 1 hour of code. That means the girls also have to do it. And then when you have that, it becomes a social experience. We're all doing it, girls and boys. Literally after that 1 hour, you haven't actually learned that much computer science, but you've experienced doing this thing with the girls, and it now has become something cool, and it becomes something that both boys and girls feel, hey, maybe this is something we want to continue doing. So,
as much as anyone else on the panel want to respond a bit to that?
Well, I think this is one of the most important challenges we have to face. When I left after my PhD at Harvard, I decided what I wanted to do was start a computer science department at a women's college. They weren't advertising for computer science because they didn't have computer science departments. So I just wrote to the presidents, and I ended up at Wellesley and started that department, which is now 35 years old. And that was exciting. 100% of my students were women. That was pretty good. But at Stanford, out of the 20%, over 30% are women in a field where nationally the number is closer to 17, so it's almost twice. 37% of the new students declaring in the previous 2 quarters, the last 2 quarters, were women. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you do it for everybody, if 100% of Stanford students majored in computer science, with 2% of the faculty, heaven forbid, it would be 51-49. It's amazing how that works. If you just get a larger N, partly because if you are skewed, then the complement of that set is skewed in the other direction, so you're going to pull more people in. But it also becomes something where people feel so much more comfortable. I get these calls from media people who think that that there are only a handful of women, and I have a slide where in tiny, tiny thumbnail images, I just show all 220 women majoring in computer science at Stanford. It's just, that's a critical mass. If you don't have the critical mass, you can't do it. But one thing I think everybody needs to know is that the data on this question are very easily understood historically, that the times when women's participation falls off are precisely the times when universities start to ratchet down the numbers. If you cut the numbers down, participation by women and minorities declines and stays down. And part of the reason for that is because most of these things are competitive. You impose a GPA, or you look for people who are taking the 2nd and 3rd course in their first year, and that biases against people who have been doing it in these high schools where there's a lot of implicit bias. You need to keep those doors open so that you can avoid the last hired, first fired model. And it's just absolutely obvious when you look at the data that there's this, in the huge collapse in the mid-'80s, that's when women's participation turned down. And then you get people talking about this as if, it was violent video games. This is the year the Macintosh was introduced. There were no video games, in that year. That can't be the explanation, right? They're horrible, but that wasn't it then. It was that every school said, no more. Even Wellesley had to do it, and I left after that. I just, it changed the nature of the program. Unless we can provide the resources that we need to teach all those people and build that critical mass, we're going to lose it again.
Yeah.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm sorry, Michael. talked about a gender problem, and you didn't let any of the women on the panel speak.
No. If they would like to speak, I didn't see that.
I was actually very conscious of that. When that question came up, I figured it was going to be thrown to me, and I didn't want to take it first. And in part, I could talk for hours, for days. Find me anytime. This is a question near and dear to my own heart. I will not give you my stump speech. I will say that the things that Ali and Eric are both doing and talking about are incredibly important. And my plea is, this is a really hard problem. Each of us is contributing to the problem, for sure. I know there are things that I do that narrow who goes into my field, that narrow what people see as possible. And I hope I do more good than not, but each of us needs to work on it. If you are a man, this is your problem, not just mine. If you are white, this is our problem, not just the single face of color that I'm seeing in the room. If you are someone who had a good education and had good resources, this is our problem. If you are in a position of privilege because you were at Harvard, this is our problem to change the demographics of who enters. And it's not just who enters, but it's also who stays. So if you are in industry, this is your problem. Right? And each one of us has to all the time be vigilant about the ways in which we are inadvertently undermining the thing that we actually want. We all have allies who can help us, and if we're willing to listen, if we're willing to hear the things we're doing that could be done differently, we can solve this problem, but we all need to own it.
Thank you. I just want to say I love the way you said that, because when Hadi, my brother, and I started Code.org, we are white, male, privileged from the tech industry. We absolutely created Code.org because we felt exactly what you said. That if we don't do it, if people like us aren't doing it, it's not going to be fixed. I do feel, though, that starting in the K through 5, if you fix it there, the solution it's just a matter of time for it to propagate up.
I teach at an institution which has historically been gender balanced since the outset, and let me tell you, that did not solve the problem.
Another question.
But there is a parallel in medicine. Speaking as a physician, when our mother went to medical school, her medical school class, coming out of a junior college and into medical school, she was an exceptionally bright young lady at the time, was about 10% at the University of Michigan. At Baylor, Baylor College of Medicine, where I am now, when I went to medical school at Michigan, it was probably about 30% of the class was female. Now it's about even-steven. It's about 50-50. So something's happening in the medical profession. We won't talk about standards, but that has shifted this balance quite dramatically in about 25 or 30 years. So what is different about CS globally than what's going on in a higher level of education in the biological sciences and medicine? I'm asking a question without an answer, at least one that I have.
Take it as a rhetorical question. Can I?
Yeah.
I just want to, before you move on to the next question.
Absolutely.
I just want to acknowledge that we have the original WICs, the 5 women from the class of 1980 in computer science. Of course, there was no such thing as computer science, so half of them were in engineering and half of them were in applied math. But they're gathered there in the first 2 rows over there.
I'm not sure if anyone on the panel feels that they have an answer to that question. So if not, maybe I'll move on to.
Nothing that won't take the rest of it.
I just want to bring up one subject that has been touched upon. The Harvard Business has a very famous approach pedagogy called case method of teaching. But that actually is somewhat of a misnomer called case method. It's a whole philosophy, and Harvard Business is almost religion. They even teach a course on teaching people how to teach by the case method. Now, when I was on a applied science faculty here before I retired, I actually went and took that course and adapted some of their techniques over to my own course on operation research here. So I just wonder whether there are people who have more experience with this method, or something that if you don't, this will take a look at?
We don't, people are looking at me, but we don't use the case methodology per se, but I do think to go back to the science of learning principles, it's exactly those two things. It's very active, you're engaged with the material, you're discussing it in class, you're discussing it with your classmates, it's building on each other. And then it's also useful in that you're able to have the same section across multiple different faculty, all repeat and actually use the same material curricularly, so that works well as too. Very cute.
There was actually a fairly large movement to do case studies in computing. Mike Clancy and Marcia Len at Berkeley did a lot of work. There are many papers in the 1980s about it. One of the difficulties with that, with other styles of learning, is how well it scales as the number of people grows. The Harvard Business School admits a very limited class. You know, I have 600 students when I teach the intro class in the fall, and I'm trying to keep as much high touch and being part of their lives as I can, but it's harder, and it's not a question. I got a note from Provost Condoleezza Rice when I was director of undergraduate studies and she was provost, saying that they had decided that every department should beef up its intro courses so that they were taught by faculty in classes of 20 students or less. And I said, fine. You realize that if we took all our faculty with the teaching load they have now, they wouldn't cover the introductory classes. Who teaches the rest? You know, I mean, it's just those numbers, and the university is not willing to make computer science be 20% of the faculty or anything close to that, and I wouldn't want them to. I'm happy to be a little overloaded, but you know, there are limits to that, and we have to find structures that we have found, we've experimented with and have found to be effective that work at scale, and we're using technology to extend our reach. But still, we think that the best strategy is to inspire in the lectures and then have undergraduates, as we do here at Harvard, teach those small sections in CS50. I mean, that's what makes it work. And without that and that ability to really, you know, it's near peer mentoring. You get to see people who are just a few years ahead of you doing amazing things that show that the university places an enormous amount of responsibility. If I hadn't been an undergraduate teaching assistant for NatSci 110, you know, I wouldn't have had the same experience I had here. Since I'd wanted to be a college professor since I was 5, I think, you know, grew up in that household, you know, I probably would have done that. But John Hennessy, our former president, says that had he not been an undergraduate CSTA at Villanova, he would never have considered going into academia. You know, it really is part of that pipeline creation, the way we do it now. And you know, one of the things that I think I am able to do in those large classes is I inspire not just the students, but our army of section leaders who are going to go on and be the next teachers, the next Harry, the next me, the next David, and next Lynn, everybody, you know. She doesn't have the big classes, but she's got better touch, you know, so she'll get a higher fraction.
This isn't exactly the direction you intended, I think, but we actually have a course that's called literally CS50 for MBAs, and in fact, in about half an hour, I go across the river to teach that, which is a smaller scale course that's more top-down than it is bottom-up, and one of the things we experimented with a couple of years ago was actually visiting some of our friends in industry and actually using technology and video to capture case studies on camera. As an aside, one of the hiccups we ran into is at least our friends in industry weren't as willing to disclose some of the interesting teachable moments, mistakes they had made in terms of engineering failures. But today, for instance, we'll be joined by an alumna from HBS, Christina, who's actually now at TripAdvisor down the road, and the whole class in just about half an hour will be a discussion of some of TripAdvisor's experience with deciding on mobile strategies, whether to do applications or websites or so forth. So in a smaller scale group, we've done that, I think, pretty successfully. And to be honest, what's been great about HBS is how they even design the classrooms with the pedagogy in mind. To Lynn's point earlier about the classroom we now have in Pierce, I mean, even a detail like that is important and changes, I think, the dynamics and the interactivity we have. And so it feels very different, even for me, teaching students over there than it does an equivalent number of students in a lot of our classrooms here.
All right. I think we'll do one last question, and then we'll break for lunch, so I can keep us roughly on schedule. David had his hand up earlier way before. I think I owe him a question.
So there's a paradox I've been sensing in some of what's being discussed. I'm not sure I can articulate it well, but I want to try in order to get some responses. It seems like we're talking about this idea that sort of computer science is something that we're sort of struggling to teach in at the university. At the same time, it's something that can be taught in third grade, and that also a teacher who was to teach it at a third grade level can get a job in the technical field. Right now, if we sort of mapped out onto something like mathematics, right, we'd say, well, yes, if you can, we're going to teach these courses in university to people who don't know any arithmetic or algebra. Well, that's remedial education. And similarly, right, we don't expect that somebody who has a third grade math level of understanding can teach third grade math is suddenly capable of doing technical work. But it seems to me that there's some sort of weird disjunct in sort of what's hard and what's easy in computing, that we haven't successfully turned computing into something that separates out the sort of elementary stuff that you learn as part of your elementary education, but is not considered, wow, you can get a job, from the stuff that is appropriate for teaching at a college level. So are we going to get there?
David, it's not the material, it's the economics of the situation. Those third grade teachers with a little knowledge of mathematics can go out and get computing jobs. It's just that they can't get mathematics jobs. When you look at what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says about the job growth in the STEM fields, it's all in computer science, but that's not where the degrees are being produced. There are 3 times as many job openings in computer science every year than there are degrees produced, and most of those degrees are coming from the for-profits. So, you probably don't want to count them. I mean, it's just not something. Just as a experiment, if you take the line item in the BLS current employment that's listed as mathematicians, and you list it's one level up. So I'm admitting that I'm the aggregate of all the computing professions. What's the ratio between the two? How many computer scientists are there for every person who's working as a mathematician? 1,000.
Yeah, I completely concur. Another interesting stat is you often hear in politicians talking about STEM jobs and how we need more STEM education to prepare more kids for these so-called STEM jobs. Most fields in STEM actually have unemployment. And I frequently speak to people, a parent whose child became a, mechanical engineer and is unemployed, or biologist and is unemployed. The word STEM jobs is accurate if you remove the STEM and replace it with computing. Something like 70% of all jobs across all STEM fields are for computing. Having said that, going back to the structure of your question, the teachers who learn how to teach AP computer science, in Java or whatever, those are the ones who really have learned enough coding that they can actually, leave their profession and become a programmer. The way the third grade curriculum is taught is actually hardly even involves the teacher. The teacher does get maybe 2 days of kind of learning how to run it, but it's almost entirely off the computer. And the Khan Academy has their version, and we have a slightly different. But essentially, the way the Code.org curriculum works, first of all, it's maybe 1 hour a week. So it's the third grade the same third grade teacher teaches all the subjects, and 1 hour a week, maybe let's say at 10 o'clock on Thursdays is the code.org hour. Everybody sits in front of their individual terminal, logs into wherever they are from last week, and then they start doing the problems, which are on-screen problems. It'll say, drag and drop the blocks to write a program to make the, Angry Bird find the pig, or so on. And then if you don't understand, click here and there will be a short video by a child teaching you how it works. Or it might be a video by, we have a number of celebrity type, we have Mark Zuckerberg teaching you how for loops work, or Bill Gates teaching you how if-then statements work. But it is all actually taught to you on the computer. The teacher's role, it could be to leave and have a cigarette, but if they're still in the classroom, the teacher's role is to kind of walk around and, oh, is anybody stuck? You're stuck. Well, Sally here can help you figure out how to do it. It's really minimal. Those are not the teachers getting jobs elsewhere, but it is actually, these kids are learning a ton from this. And hopefully the teachers actually are also learning it and helping them, but they don't need to. It is possible to teach millions of kids these basics without waiting for all of those 3rd, 4th, 5th grade teachers to know them.
I think Lynn and Jonathan? Or?
Oh, I was going to suggest one thing along that continuum as well. So we at Minerva actually take a very strong stance that we don't teach introductory classes because that information is all available on the web, so why should we take students' money to teach that? It puts a lot of onus on the student, and I'm sure for some it's a very controversial stance, and like CS50, for example, is like the largest enrolled class at Harvard, so clearly there's some demand for it by the time students get here. But it is an interesting question over time of like, what is the role of computer science at a college, at university level, versus what do we expect students to come in knowing, either because it's just baked into the curriculum or because they are able to learn it. And then that affects whether or not you need the 1 to 600 lecture freshman year, or do you literally do that ahead of time and it's done over the course of their high school. And I think that's something that's going to be very interesting that plays out over next several years.
Actually, sorry, go ahead. I just actually wanted to pose a question, sorry, to Eric, which is, I wonder, maybe I'll, by the time I finish the sentence, I'll realize that it's a stupid question, but I wonder if the percentage of kids studying AP Computer Science A in high school went up, if enough, let's say if instead of 3% it was 85%, would that take enough pressure off your introductory class to kind of help some, would that make the problem worse or better?
I think the jury is out on that one. We'd have to see. We do not give credit for the AP, even the CSA, unless people take a follow-on course because we don't know what's in that class. So we use it for placement, and if you place out, then in fact you get the credit for it. But we found that to be the only workable strategy. And until we know a little bit more about how that's going, and the numbers in CSA are skyrocketing, as you know, along with CS principals because of the demand for CS. But there's still a lot that we find that people don't know when they come in, and we need to fix that before they can be successful.
So I'd like to actually take this question and step back a little bit, because I think the question of how we teach computer science, what computer science is, what people need to know, whether it's 3rd grade material or undergraduate material or highly technical graduate material, the answer is yes, it's all of those, and there's a lot of really exciting work going on to figure out which pieces are best shaped where. But this is actually not a panel solely about computer science or computer science education. We're here because of Harry and because of computer science education at Harvard. And one of the things that I believe really, really deeply is that computer science, or computing, computational thinking, if you will, is becoming like writing. It's a basic literacy skill that everybody needs. It's also a thing that some people need a different level of expertise in, and thank God for people like Guy Steele, but I'm not sure that that's what our 3rd graders need to know. But here at Harvard, and certainly with Harry's guidance, computer science is a thing that is both an area you can dive into deeply and a thing that is connected. So I don't know whether you know this, Harry, but the reason I became a computer science major is I actually applied for a special concentration. I had this wonderful idea for a major that was going to encompass everything. And I wrote a brilliant proposal. And the very nice person who ran special concentrations at the time very nicely told me I was not going to be allowed to do a special concentration, but maybe I should try this brand new major. I am a member of the first class who, as a sophomore, could declare computer science. And they sent me to computer science. Now, I've never quite understood what the person who told me that was thinking when she said computer science was basically what I wanted to do because I wanted this very broad, encompassing major. But I have, from time to time, thought she was really prescient. Because I do think that computer science and computing is touching and transforming everything. And so however we go about teaching it, to third graders, to undergraduates, to people online, to people who are interested in how they can use this to get a job, to change their lives, we should not be teaching them about the mechanics of computation without teaching them how that relates to their lives and their worlds and all the other things they care about. And that is what I learned as a computer science major here.
So I think that's a great place to end the panel and have us move to lunch. I would like, and I hope all of you would like to thank the outstanding panel. Again, Lynn Stein, David Malin, Eric Roberts, Jonathan Katzman, Hannah Bloomberg, and Ali Partovi. Let's thank them all.